I had to sneak back out here, okay? I'm not supposed to be out here. I snuck back out here simply because I wanted to just underscore the importance of this next conversation. So in your book, in your bag, you received The Anti-Racist Leader, that book, right? That book was written by James White and his daughter, Krista White. But in our conference description, I wanted to just read to you what it says about and how it describes this book, so pardon me. Achieving true DEIB involves a new approach to everything, from recruiting to giving assignments to determining what makes someone a cultural fit. It generally takes several years of intentional change. It means applying analytics as rigorously as in every other aspect of the business. And it requires leaders who are fully committed to creating a diverse, anti-racist culture at every level of the organization. So James is going to share more about who he is when he gets on stage. But I definitely want to underscore Fortune's senior editor, Ellen McGirt. Every week, I get the jump start on the most progressive, the most important topics in DEIB, and I think Michael said it, but I want to underscore, if you haven't already scrolled to fortune.com and got her newsletter coming to your inbox, you need to do that before she gets on stage. She serves up the most compelling stories. She covers the most important people. She's a change agent. She's one of us, and she always brings us along with her. All right? So give them a warm welcome.
Please welcome to the stage James D. White, board chair of The Honest Company, and Ellen McGirt, senior editor at Fortune.
Oh, it is good to be home. The Great Place to Work conference was the last conference I attended before the world shut down. This is the one I lived for to come back to. I even bought retail for this. I'll be back in my outlet mall glory tomorrow, but it is just so good to be here. I can't quite see everybody, but I can absolutely feel the energy. And James, I am so excited to be talking with you. Thank you for this book. I'm going to wave the book around. I blurbed this book for Race Ahead back when HBR had a shorter sort of preview version. I want to say it was May 2020. Within seconds, I started getting emails, tweets, direct messages. Yes, this. Who is this man? Why do I not know him from before? And an entire conversation started in my very active audience. And here's what I told them to do, and I'm going to tell everybody to do this. Buy 2 copies. Send one to your CEO or CEO of a company that you think needs this information. Send another copy to the board chair. Tell them I, and now James, sent you. Then expense it.
Absolutely love that, and we actually have more than 2 copies available for each of you and your teams.
A lot of books do promise a blueprint forward. This one actually delivers. I think it's particularly powerful because it's also part memoir, and you do bring a lot of yourself into this conversation. But before we begin, I wanted to ask you to read the opening paragraph in the book. It is one of the most powerful of many powerful moments in the book. It made me immediately know that we were together on this and that I could trust what comes next.
Thank you, and I appreciate you allowing me to start in this special place, and I'll share a little bit of the backstory after. And maybe up front I'll say my daughter, Krista, who wrote the book with me, came to me late May, early June of 2020 and said, "Dad, I've got a different way for us to start the book." I proceed to have her read this paragraph that I'll share with you today. This book is not apolitical. This book is explicitly anti-racist, pro-black, pro-LGBTQIA, and feminist. This book takes the stance that Black Lives Matter, that LGBTQIA rights are human rights, that people of all abilities deserve respect and access, and that people of all genders have the right to sovereignty over their bodies and identities. This book acknowledges that capitalism is built on the foundation of systemic racism, and that to have a truly diverse, equitable, and inclusive work environment, we must acknowledge a historic present injustices faced by marginalized people. And And again, my daughter wrote this kind of unedited in 2020, and it, created a bit of pause for me. And it was interesting. We have a discussion the next day with members of the team, and the comment was, "James, you're a mainstream business person. Do you care if you ever work again?" So just
Right.
let that soak in. And I said, I really don't. I think there's going to be plenty of places that'll share up my values as we try to create a better work world for all of us moving forward. But just I'm forever grateful to really the vision and courage that my daughter showed in this process.
But that kind of warning really speaks to the sentiment of racial anxiety and fear and backlash that so many of us come up against in the workplace. And I do want to talk about your ways to address it. But I want to talk about a little bit about your story. This is also a memoir. The best business books also are. And very much like Michael C., son of Booker T., you do tell some stories, not just your own, but of extraordinary people that many of you know. Lisa Wardell of Atalum, who I have interviewed, Bernard Tyson of Kaiser Permanente, who I miss very much, Roz Brewer now at Walgreens. When you're a black business journalist, you have a short list of all the black CEOs, and you do get to interview them more than once. It's been a great blessing and a curse of lack of representation. But you share their stories of their pain, too, not just their achievement, but where their racial identity caused actual pain in the workplace and also in their lives. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about your own, but I was curious what it felt like as a writer, to collect stories that you knew so well, commit them to paper, and really see their impact.
It was a combination of humbling and inspiring just to see we interviewed 24 executives, Krista and I, for the book, and we had a series of questions, and we really wanted to understand what it was like to walk in their shoes and try to lead the kind of transformations that all of these great leaders led inside their respective companies.
So I'm going to go back to your career before we dig into some high-level takeaways from the 7 steps that you provide. I don't want to turn this into a consulting session, although I really kind of do. But you have had an extraordinary, impressive career in corporate life, and it has progressed the way things progressed. And there are 2 stories, as you walk us through them, I'd love for you to pause on. One was something that happened earlier in your career at Coca-Cola, right? When you were a person who showed up and serviced accounts. And the other was what I think is a great moment as a leadership nerd in sort of business history, when you confronted and talked to the board at Jamba Juice before you accepted the job, the turnaround job, which
Sure.
ended up being. So just tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so just a little bit about my background. St. Louis, Missouri native, and we kind of share, St. Louis is
Yes.
home.
I didn't go to high school there, but I do live there now.
And for me, first member of my family to graduate from college, and one of the stories that I talk about in the book that I'd never talked about before 2020 was my first job out of college was with the Coca-Cola Company. I had a sales territory that was in southwest, southeast Missouri, and my first week on the job, they had to remove a part of the territory that was in Arkansas because it was the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. So if you can imagine a young man, first member of my family, in business, I'm excited about working for one of the great companies in America, and that's what I have to sit down with my boss and carve out a part of the territory for that reason. What I didn't think about at the time, but I've kind of since been able to reflect on, if I step back and look at most of my sales territory, most of it would have been sundown towns.
Yeah.
And sundown towns are places where it's unhealthy to be a black or a brown person. And I remember one specific instance where I was calling on a supermarket, and I was selling Minute Maid orange juice at the time. I show up, and the manager says, "James, we heard you were in town. We just advised that you're not here after dark." And this was actually somebody trying to be helpful. So that's one story. Just let that sink in. I had never talked about that before 2020. There are a lot of stories that I talked about as we all went through the racial reckoning, and this was one of the important kind of life lessons that allowed people to, kind of walk in my shoes across a career that had been successful with many, many obstacles that most of us don't think about having to face.
And that's also what majority culture, but white leaders in the U.S. in particular, also are not thinking about when they think about the black talent that's all around them. Do you find that this kind of candor is making a difference?
One of the things we focus on the book is this idea around empathy. I think empathy is going to need to be really a core capability moving forward, and that's something that my daughter honed in on. She heard me talk a lot about empathy, and her fundamental question is, Dad, can you develop empathy if you don't naturally have it?
Right.
And I think as we interviewed the fantastic leaders for the book, the answer is a resounding yes, but it takes work. You've got to be committed to listening more than talking. You've got to find ways to create experiences that would allow you to walk in another person's shoes for at least a brief moment. And one of the things that I've done from a leadership perspective is taken leaders into environments like the Black MBA conference,
right,
or the old Nashimba, which is the Latinx conference where there is 10,000 Black or Hispanics for a day, and it just gives folks that are from the majority culture an opportunity to experience what it's like to walk into every room, walk on the elevator, and have all the faces that you see be people of color.
Right.
And they only have to do it for that few days. We have to live in these skins for an entire, kind of lifetime. The one other story that we tell in the book, there was an executive that worked with me at Nestle Purina, and we sent him to a women's conference.
Wow.
And there were 500 women in the audience, maybe 10 men or so. And the long and the short of this story is he was so stressed out being the only one for 8 hours, he couldn't make it to dinner.
Oh my
True
Lord.
Story.
I believe it. I just the image of this a white leader like in the elevator at a Hispanic or a Black conference and watching everybody in the elevator code switch at once to greet them. I think that would be an amazing experience.
Yes.
All right, I want to get to Jamba Juice in a second, but mindful of time, I'm going to read through some of the top lines of the meat of the book, of the blueprint. I have a very specific question to ask. Here's the 7 steps. Listening to and learning from colleagues across the organization, enlisting senior executives to the cause, auditing the culture, documenting what's already being done to foster diversity and inclusion, establishing benchmarks for measuring progress, building action learning teams, I just love that, to spearhead the effort, and developing and communicating an action plan. That is the 7 steps well outlined in the book to build an anti-racist organization. It all sounds very straightforward when I sit home, in my bunny slippers and I read your very, very well-organized book, but we know that it's not. In your experience, where in this process are leaders likely to derail?
I'd make a couple points. I mean, the first premise of the book is the CEO, she actually has to lead this work. This is the work of culture, so it can't be delegated. So that's the point, first point. The second point is this is all about systems and processes.
Yeah.
Every process that touches a human being, we should evaluate and make sure we unbias those systems, and that requires great discipline and lots of work over time. But I think the focal leverage point is the middle management of the organization, and some people describe it as the movable middle, the frozen middle, the immovable middle, whichever of those it is in your organization. That's the place where we've got to really bring all the things that we talk about at this For All conference. We've got to bring the right set of tools, the right set of investment to make sure that that set of leaders really gets this work. It's not optional work at that level. If you lead people inside an organization, it's not optional.
Right.
Other leaders in the organization need to hold you accountable, and you need to set the example and actually hold yourself accountable for this work. And the further point that I'd make, anything in business that matters, we measure it. So this is work we have to measure, and if we tie appropriately incentives, we'll actually move this work, and this is the right way to sustain building anti-racist culture.
So you mentioned the middle, and I consider that sort of my base, because I have such empathy and sympathy for the enormous pressure that they're on. It's just getting more and more as the world gets more complicated. You have to deliver on time, under budget, and reduce your carbon footprint, and you have to solve racism. It's just, there's so much that's happening there. But you mentioned empathy, but the human side of this, I'm curious if you are seeing a different type of leader emerging or being successful in the workplace, and what are some of the behaviors and characteristics that you're seeing, particularly that would help a majority culture leader feel less anxious about making a mistake and retreating from the conversation entirely, because that kind of identity anxiety is so real.
Yeah, I'll go back to one of the points that Michael made in his opening. This is really work that is about for all. And I think the best leaders as we move forward are going to find ways to create spaces and opportunity and access for us all to bring our full selves, to the job. And the best companies know that they're actually competing for
Right.
talent and competing for the future, and they won't have problems with the Great Resignation. They won't have problems with their next generation of leaders. But the point that I'd make is, as I look at the companies that have come through the last couple years the strongest, those are the companies that have leaders that really have displayed great empathy. And you'll hear from one of the fantastic leaders who I happen to have worked for in my career, Brian Cornell at Target. I think he's a good example. I won't steal the thunder of what he'll talk about with you, but he's a good example to pay attention to. And there are leaders in this environment that are separating themselves in their organizations by focusing on people and making sure they've got the right systems and processes in place to play to the future.
Please don't leave us without telling the Jamba Juice story. I know it's one of my favorites in the books because it's such a powerful moment where you hold a powerful board to account as they tap you to turn around this struggling company. It's one of my favorites.
Well, I'll try to make a long story short. As I'm interviewing for the Jamba CEO assignment, one of the things that I think in part won me the job, very powerful, accomplished board, but the company, as I took over as CEO in December 2008, was actually on the brink of going out of the world the wrong way. And one of my final comments is, how could this group have allowed this great brand that was bigger than the company to be in such dire straits? My commitment from a leadership perspective is that I would focus on people and culture first,
Right.
that I'd be able to get more discretionary effort out of the team than any leader they'd see. And we came in and got to the work of changing the culture and transformed the company and had really phenomenal growth, but we focused on people.
As someone who's not a CEO and is unlikely to ever be a CEO, that moment was such a powerful story. Here is the person who's been tapped to turn around the company. He's standing in a room when we all stood in rooms together full of very powerful, very accomplished white investors and men who have let this company go astray, and you said, how could you have let this happen? I know it just hit me, like those kinds of conversations are powerful when you have people who are committed to culture change in the room. It was just a leadership nerd. It was a wonderful moment. So I want to end, and congratulations because you actually did it. I want to end on the future and what's possible in the future. You talk, all throughout the book, you talk about becoming an intentional leader and what that looks like. And there are real takeaways, there's real talking points, there is a plan. But it's somehow what you're really talking about is imbuing courage into the actual system, imbuing listening and empathy and change and action into the actual system. How do you advise the senior leaders and CEOs that you work with how to stay the course? Because this work can be so difficult.
Well, I think it's challenging work, and you have to actually play the long game. It's not an event. It's not something that happens over the course of a few quarters. This work is going to be forever changing. But the thing that gives me hope is the next couple generations that we find in the workforce. Many of you are in this room, millennials and Gen Zs, are actually going to hold the companies that they work for into account very differently. And the best leaders really understand that they've got to create an environment that is a for-all environment where we all can bring our full selves authentically to the table. And I think you're going to see a new type of CEO emerge that is more focused on empathy as a core capability. I think there is an opportunity for us to spend more time thinking about empathy as a core competency in the middle management of the organization. And I think the companies that get that really are set up to win moving forward.
So thank you so much for getting us farther down the path of becoming fluent in the language of anti-racism. What's next for you and Krista? I know you're very committed to this work, and what can we do to be part of it besides buy 2 books, send them to a powerful person, and expense it?
I'd make a couple comments in the point. Join me in this journey. I mean, this is now my life's work. It's kind of after 2020. This is a calling. This is not a space that I spent time in.
Right.
I'm an operating executive. I'm a board member. But I'm squarely focused on catalyzing this discussion both in the boardroom and across companies that are truly trying to become anti-racist. And if you really want to help, you can buy 2 or you can buy 10 books. Grateful, and I appreciate you sharing the discussion with me this morning, Ellen. My great pleasure.
No, I appreciate as such a powerful operator that you're moving into this kind of space with this kind of conversation, so boldly using the language. It has been a lonely place for lots of us. It's good to join your company and watch you work. So thank you so much for this, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you.